The company's cold billionaire CEO was caught changing behind locked doors. But what a hardworking janitor saw on her back will break your heart. In that one forbidden second, he didn't see power. He saw deep, terrifying purple bruises. He expected to get fired on the spot to protect her perfect public image. But instead, she offered him a promotion with a massive salary. She isn't trying to buy his silence for a crime. She is hiding a secret that is slowly destroying her from the inside out. Where are you watching this emotional story from? Drop your country flag in the comments below. If you believe true love and loyalty still exist, hit that subscribe button. The cold, fluorescent lights of Queen Enterprises buzzed softly as midnight approached. While the upper management of the multi-billion-dollar corporation slept in their suburban mansions, Paulo Fernandes moved quietly through the empty corridors of the top floor. He held a mop in one hand and a bottle of glass cleaner in the other. His shoulders ached from a shift that had started 12 hours ago, but his movements remained steady and deliberate. Paulo was a tall man, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen too many long nights. Yet, he never allowed himself to slow down. For Paulo, every polished floor and every emptied trash bin represented survival. It was the only way to keep a roof over his head and, more importantly, to keep his 7-year-old daughter alive. Every night followed the exact same demanding routine. Paulo would arrive at the towering glass skyscraper just as the sun began to set. Blending into the background in his faded blue janitorial uniform, he was invisible to the executives who rushed past him, shouting into their expensive smartphones. To them, he was just a part of the building's hardware, an unnamed fixture that erased their mess before the next business day. Paulo did not mind the anonymity. In fact, he preferred it. It allowed him to focus entirely on his work and get home to his daughter, Kenzie Fernandes, before she woke up for school. Life had not been kind to Paulo since his wife passed away 3 years ago. The tragedy left him as a single father in a city that offered no mercy to those without money. His entire world now revolved around Kenzie. She was a bright, cheerful 7-year-old girl with a smile that could dissolve all of Paulo's exhaustion in a single second. However, Kenzie was fragile. She had been born with a weak heart, a medical condition that required constant monitoring, specialized doctors, and incredibly expensive medication. Every single dollar Paulo earned was carefully split between rent, basic groceries, and the growing mountain of medical bills that arrived in his mailbox every month. He wore shoes with worn-out soles and skipped lunch almost every day, but he made sure Kenzie never missed a dose of her medicine. By the time Paulo finished cleaning the main lobby, the clock on the wall showed 2 in the morning. His muscles screamed for rest, but his heart felt a sudden warmth as he thought about his destination. He locked his cleaning cart in the supply closet, changed out of his uniform, and began the long walk back to his small, cramped apartment on the edge of the city. The night air was freezing, biting through his thin jacket, but Paulo walked fast. He could not afford public transportation this week, so his own 2 feet had to carry him across the 6 miles that separated his workplace from his home. When he finally unlocked the door to his apartment, the rooms were dark and completely silent. He walked on his tiptoes toward Kenzie's tiny bedroom, pushing the door open just a few inches. The soft moonlight fell across her face as she slept peacefully beneath a faded blanket. Paulo smiled, his chest tightening with an overwhelming wave of love and responsibility. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden toy car that he had found abandoned in the building's lost and found section weeks ago, which he had carefully cleaned and repainted during his rare breaks. He placed the little car gently on her bedside table, right next to her half-empty water glass and her pill bottles. He smoothed the strand of hair away from her forehead and whispered a quiet promise to the silent room that he would always find a way to protect her, no matter how hard the world became. Paulo then closed the door softly, stepping back into the small living room where reality waited for him. On the kitchen counter sat 3 large envelopes with bright red stamps. He did not need to open them to know what they said. They were final notices for Kenzie's cardiology appointments from the past 2 months, along with an updated balance from the pharmacy. The numbers were staggering, growing much faster than his hourly wage could ever match. Paulo rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the heavy weight of his financial reality settling onto his chest. He had only 4 hours before he needed to wake up and start his second job at a local grocery store, but sleep felt miles away. The next afternoon, the exhausting routine continued. Paulo stood behind the cash register at the market. his mind drifting back to his daughter while his hands mechanically scanned groceries. His body was running on pure adrenaline and cheap black coffee. He had skipped breakfast again, replacing the meal with a glass of tap water to ensure Kenzie had fresh milk and fruit in the refrigerator. Every dollar saved was a victory, no matter how small. Yet despite his best efforts, the gap between his income and his expenses was widening into a dangerous canyon. The pharmacy had already warned him that they could not extend his credit line past the end of the month. If he could not pay the outstanding balance, Kenzie's next shipment of life-saving heart medication would be delayed. By 7 in the evening, Paulo was back at Queen Enterprises, gripping the handle of his mop with numb fingers. Now the corporate offices were slowly emptying, the bright lights casting long shadows across the expensive marble floors. As he cleaned the executive suites, Paulo maintained his quiet, observant nature. He noticed the subtle patterns of the building, especially those of the woman who ruled it. Viera Queen, the notoriously cold and demanding CEO, was always the last to leave. She was a legend among the staff, known for firing managers over a single typo and running the company with absolute, merciless discipline. Nobody spoke to her unless they were spoken to, and even then, people trembled. Paulo watched from a distance as Viera walked down the hallway, her sharp heels clicking like a ticking clock against the polished floor. She looked impeccable, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, her posture rigid and unyielding. She did not glance at Paulo as she passed him. To her, he was just another shadow in the background. But Paulo, who was trained to notice details, saw small signs that others missed. He noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she held her leather briefcase. He saw the tight, strained lines around her mouth and the way she occasionally leaned against the wall for a brief second when she thought no one was looking. It was a fragile sort of perfection. Precisely at 8 o'clock, Viera locked the main door to her private executive suite, a strict routine she never broke. Paulo knew that once that door closed, the entire top floor belonged to him and his cleaning supplies. He wiped down the glass partitions, keeping his head down and focusing on his tasks, trying to drown out the constant anxiety about Kenzie's medical bills. Everything seemed normal, a routine he had repeated 100 times before. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building, and Paulo knew that this fragile balance could not last forever. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday evening when the weight of the entire week finally caught up with him. Paulo had spent the afternoon running between the grocery store and the hospital pharmacy, begging for a short extension on Kenzie's account. By the time he started his cleaning shift at Queen Enterprises, his vision was slightly blurred from exhaustion and lack of food. He forced himself to move, floor by floor, pushing his heavy cleaning cart through the quiet corridors. His mind was so consumed by the image of the unpaid medical invoices waiting on his kitchen counter that his usual sharp focus began to slip. When he reached the top floor, the clock on the wall showed a few minutes past 8. According to the strict schedule he always followed, the executive floor should have been entirely empty. He noticed that the heavy oak door to the main executive suite was not fully shut. It remained slightly ajar, leaving a narrow vertical line of light leaking into the dim hallway, assuming that a rushed executive had simply forgotten to secure the room before leaving for the night. Paulo pushed his cart closer. He knocked softly twice, announcing his presence as required by protocol, but no voice answered from within. He pushed the door open completely and stepped into the luxurious office, holding a fresh black trash bag in his hand. He intended to quickly empty the wastebasket near the desk and leave. But as he stepped past the wooden partition that separated the main office from the private dressing area, he stopped dead in his tracks. The breath left his lungs instantly. Viera Queen was standing near the large glass window, her back turned to the door. She had unbuttoned her dark red silk shirt, letting the fabric slip completely down past her shoulders. She was in the middle of adjusting a thick, beige lumbar support brace around her waist. But it was not the medical brace that made Paulo freeze in absolute horror. Across the pale skin of her upper back, stretching from her shoulder blades down to her spine, were deep, terrifying, purple and black bruises. The markings looked agonizingly painful, marring her skin like a violent map of hidden trauma. The soft rustle of Paulo's plastic trash bag broke the absolute silence of the room. Viera turned around instantly, her movements sharp and defensive as she pulled the red silk shirt back over her shoulders to cover herself. Her face, usually an unbending mask of corporate perfection, was pale with an intense mixture of shock, fury, and naked vulnerability. For a brief, agonizing second, the powerful CEO looked completely cornered. Paulo stood frozen, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he looked at the powerful woman who held his entire financial survival in her hands. He realized the immense gravity of what he had just witnessed. In the corporate world, a low-level janitor discovering the deeply hidden, physical vulnerability of a ruthless billionaire was an unpardonable mistake. He knew his presence had shattered her carefully protected facade. The terrifying silence that followed filled the room like a suffocating fog. Viera coldly ordered him to leave and threatened him to remain silent, her voice trembling despite its sharp, commanding edge. Paulo did not look back. He stumbled out of the executive suite, his chest heaving as he reached the empty hallway. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold on to the handle of his mop. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded his veins. He stood in the dimly lit corridor, staring at the closed door, realizing that his entire world had just collapsed in a single, unscripted moment. He had seen the terrifying purple bruises covering the back of the most powerful woman in the company. In the corporate world, knowing a dangerous secret about someone like Viera Queen did not make you safe fit, made you a liability that needed to be removed. Paulo's mind raced through the immediate brutal consequences. He was going to be fired, there was no doubt in his mind. Viera was ruthless, and she would never allow a low-level janitor to walk around carrying a secret that could destroy her carefully constructed image of perfection. Tears of frustration and fear stung his eyes as he leaned against the cold glass window, looking out at the city lights. If he lost this job, his healthcare benefits would vanish instantly. Without his steady income and the company insurance plan, there was absolutely no way he could pay for Kenzie's monthly medication. The image of his 7-year-old daughter sleeping peacefully under her faded blanket flashed across his mind. He remembered the quiet promise he had made to her just hours before. The thought of failing her made him feel physically sick. If Kenzie missed her treatments, her weak heart would begin to fail. The doctors had already warned him that time was a luxury they did not have. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, an agonizing despair that trapped him between the necessity of survival and the terror of absolute ruin. He had worked so hard, skipped so many meals, and endured endless humiliation just to keep his daughter safe, only for everything to be threatened by an unlocked door and a wrong turn. He spent the remaining hours of his shift moving like a ghost through the building, his heart pounding every time a phone rang or an elevator dinged. He expected security guards to corner him at any moment, hand him a pink slip, and escort him out of the premises. Every shadow seemed threatening. The natural, easy silence of the night had turned into an oppressive cage. He kept rehearsing explanations in his head, desperate pleas he could make to Viera if she gave him a chance to speak. He wanted to tell her that he did not care about her secrets, that he was just a father trying to save his little girl, but he knew that powerful people rarely listened to the explanations of the invisible. When the morning sun finally broke through the horizon, painting the skyscraper in shades of orange and gold, Paulo felt no relief. He changed out of his uniform with heavy, sluggish movements. His body was entirely exhausted, but his mind was completely awake, tortured by the looming uncertainty of the coming day. He walked out of the building into the crisp morning air, his throat tight with unexpressed grief. He had to go home and look Kenzie in the eyes, pretending that everything was perfectly fine, while knowing that by tomorrow they might have nothing left. Paulo spent the entire day in a state of silent agony, checking his phone every few minutes for the dreaded call from human resources. He barely remembered his afternoon shift at the grocery store. His mind was entirely consumed by the image of Viera Queen's bruised back and her terrifying cold warning. When evening arrived and he walked back through the doors of Queen Enterprises, he felt like a man walking toward his own execution. He kept his head down, hoping to blend into the shadows, but the moment he punched his time card, the shift supervisor intercepted him. The words were short and definitive. The chief executive officer wanted to see him in her office immediately. Paulo's heart hammered against his ribs as the executive elevator ascended to the top floor. He stepped out onto the plush carpet, his hands sweating. He knocked softly on the heavy oak door of Viera's suite. Her sharp voice granted him entry, and he walked in, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floor. Viera sat behind her massive mahogany desk, looking as pristine and unyielding as ever. There was no sign of the vulnerability he had witnessed the night before. She didn't speak for a long, agonizing minute, letting the silence fill the room like a heavy fog. Paulo braced himself, waiting for the words that would terminate his employment and destroy his daughter's future. Instead, Viera leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the desk. She looked at him with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. She did not yell, nor did she present him with a severance package. Instead, she slid a thick white folder across the polished wood toward him. She told him that as of this moment he was no longer a member of the janitorial staff. He was being promoted to the position of personal assistant for private areas. The role came with a private desk right outside her inner office, a strict requirement of absolute confidentiality, and a massive salary increase that was 5 times what he currently earned. Paulo stared at the document, completely stunned. His mind struggled to process the information. He looked up, his voice cracking slightly as he asked why she would offer such a position to a simple janitor who had seen something he shouldn't have. Viera's expression remained frozen, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. She coldly informed him that she did not believe in coincidences, nor did she trust people who could be easily bought by outsiders. She explained that by keeping him close, under a strict, legally binding non-disclosure agreement, she could ensure his complete compliance. She made it clear that the promotion was not a reward. It was a cage built of gold.
Yes.
If he ever spoke a single word about what he saw, she would not just fire him, she would ruin him financially and legally. Despite the hidden threat, Paulo felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief that almost made his knees buckle. He looked at the salary figure written in bold ink on the contract. It was more than enough to cover all of Kenzie's past due medical bills, secure her future treatments, and buy the expensive medicine without skipping another meal. He did not care about Viera's cold motives or the golden cage she was placing him in. To save his daughter, he would gladly step into any trap. He picked up the pen resting on the desk, his hands steady for the first time in days, and signed his name at the bottom of the page. The very next morning, Paulo transitioned from his faded blue janitorial uniform into a simple, dark suit that he had managed to buy using a small advance from his new salary. I took his seat at the sleek desk stationed right outside Viera Queen's private office. His new responsibilities were straightforward but required absolute precision, managing her private calendar, ensuring her personal quarters were entirely secure, and keeping the rest of the corporate staff at a distance. However, the sudden and unexplained elevation of a low-level janitor to the highest floor of the skyscraper did not go unnoticed. By midday, the corporate offices were buzzing with toxic rumors. High-ranking managers and senior executives who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder looked at Paulo with open hostility. They could not comprehend how a man who cleared trash bins just 48 hours ago was now sitting outside the CEO's door. During his lunch break in the communal area, the whispers were loud and deliberate. People stared at him, making snide remarks about his lack of a college degree and accusing him of using cheap, manipulative tricks to gain the cold CEO's favor. Paulo kept his head down, ignoring the glares and the insults. He reminded himself that their cruelty did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the steady income that guaranteed Kenzie's safety. But the conflict inside the office was only part of the growing complication. As Paulo spent more hours in close proximity to Viera, he began to notice strange inconsistencies in her daily routine. Despite her reputation as an unyielding machine, her physical strain was becoming harder to hide. One afternoon, while preparing her office for a major board meeting, Paulo noticed a specific, bitter-smelling herbal tea that she ordered him to brew 3 times a day. Later, while clearing her desk after she left for a brief presentation, he found a drawer that had been left slightly unlocked. Inside, beneath a stack of standard corporate reports, was a thick medical file from a specialized oncology and blood research clinic. Paulo quickly closed the drawer, his heart beating fast. He remembered the deep, purple bruises he had seen on her back. The puzzle pieces in his mind were beginning to shift, but the picture still did not make sense. He began to wonder if Viera's cold facade was actually a shield protecting a much deeper, more dangerous secret than anyone in the building realized. The pressure on him intensified when a senior vice president cornered him near the elevators, demanding to know what Viera did behind closed doors and offering Paulo a significant bribe for information. Paulo refused instantly, his loyalty to his contract absolute. Meanwhile, life at home was becoming a delicate balancing act. Although he now had the money to buy Kenzie's expensive medication, His new role demanded long, unpredictable hours. He was spending less time with his daughter, relying on a trusted neighbor to watch her during the late evenings. Every time he called home, Kenzie's voice sounded increasingly faint and tired. The financial relief was real, but the emotional cost was rising. Paulo felt trapped between a hostile workplace full of people trying to tear him down, a mysterious boss whose secrets were growing heavier, and a fragile little girl at home who needed her father more than ever. The stability he thought he had bought with his signature was already starting to fracture. It broke completely on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Paulo was reviewing Viera's evening schedule when his personal phone rang, the screen displaying the number of his neighbor. His heart dropped. When he answered, the neighbor's voice was frantic, explaining that Kenzie had suddenly collapsed in the living room, her face pale and her breathing shallow. An ambulance was already carrying her to the municipal hospital. Paulo stood up so fast his chair crashed against the floor. His hands shook as he grabbed his coat, the terrifying image of his fragile daughter fighting for her life blocking out every other thought. He had to get to her immediately. Before he could reach the elevators, a loud voice commanded him to stop. A senior vice president, accompanied by 2 corporate security guards, blocked his path. The executive accused Paulo of a severe security breach, claiming that confidential financial documents regarding a pending corporate merger had been downloaded from Viera's private computer using Paulo's personal login credentials. Paulo looked at the executive in absolute disbelief. He tried to explain that he knew nothing about the files and that his 7-year-old daughter was currently in an emergency room, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The corporate managers, who had hated his sudden promotion from the beginning, had finally found a way to frame him and destroy his reputation. They marched him directly into Viera's office. The CEO sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of stone, as the senior vice president laid out the fabricated evidence against Paulo, demanding his immediate arrest and termination. Paulo felt a cold sweat cover his entire body. He looked at Viera, desperation tearing through his chest. He was trapped in a nightmare. If he was arrested, he would not be able to see Kenzie at the hospital. If he was fired for corporate espionage, the medical insurance would be canceled instantly, and his access to his funds would be frozen. He stood in the center of the luxurious office, surrounded by powerful people who viewed him as nothing more than disposable garbage, facing complete and total ruin. The silence in the room became suffocating as Viera stared at him, her cold eyes analyzing his panicked expression. She demanded an explanation, her voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Paulo felt a profound sense of emptiness wash over him. The mountain of bills, the long nights of cleaning, the toxic whispers of the office, and the terrifying fear of losing his only child all came crashing down at once. Every ounce of his energy vanished, leaving him completely exhausted. He realized that fighting their elaborate lies was useless. He had no power, no influence, and no time to play their corporate games while his daughter's heart was failing. He looked directly at Viera, ignoring the security guards and the smirking vice president. His voice was quiet, hollow, and stripped of all pride. He did not beg for his job, nor did he argue about the missing files. He simply told her that he had never touched the documents, but that it no longer mattered. All he cared about was the little girl currently hooked up to machines in a hospital bed across town. With his shoulders slumped and his spirit completely broken, Paulo prepared to accept his fate, believing that his desperate struggle to save Kenzie had finally reached its tragic, definitive end. He took a deep breath, looked Viera Queen directly in the eyes, and made his final choice. He refused to waste his precious remaining time defending himself against a complex web of corporate lies. He looked at the senior vice president and then back at the CEO, his voice low but completely firm. He told Viera that he was resigning from his position immediately, effective that very second. He stated that they could keep the prestigious title, the office, and the golden cage she had built for him. Paulo then laid his security badge quietly on her desk, explained the harsh truth that he had kept hidden for so long. His 7-year-old daughter was currently in the intensive care unit fighting for her life, and she needed an emergency heart surgery that cost more than he could ever hope to earn. He did not plead for mercy, nor did he beg for his job. He simply asked Viera for one final thing, his final paycheck for the days he had already worked, just enough to pay the hospital's admission fee so the doctors would not turn his daughter away. He told her that his integrity was the only thing he had left, and he would not trade it to save himself from their false accusations. The senior vice president scoffed, calling his emotional explanation a pathetic excuse to escape justice, and urged Viera to call the police immediately. The security guards moved a step closer to Paulo, ready to restrain him. But before they could lay a hand on his suit, Viera raised her hand. The gesture was small, but it carried an absolute authority that instantly froze everyone in the room. The office became so silent that the heavy sound of the rain tapping against the glass windows seemed deafening. Viera stared at the security badge on her desk, her face still an unreadable mask, though Paulo noticed the subtle, familiar tremor in her fingers, growing slightly worse. Paulo did not wait for her verdict. Every second he spent standing in this luxurious room was a second stolen from Kenzie. He turned his back on the powerful executives, ignoring the protocol, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. His decision was incredibly risky. Leaving now meant he might face legal arrest later, and stepping away from this high-paying job meant he had no certain way to pay for the full surgery. He was stepping into complete financial darkness, but his heart was clear. A father's duty was to be beside his child when the world was collapsing. He pushed the doors open, determined to walk or even run the entire distance to the municipal hospital to hold his daughter's hand. As he reached the executive elevator bank, his mind was entirely focused on Kenzie's pale face and her fragile heartbeat. He pressed the button, his calloused thumb leaving a faint smudge on the polished silver panel. He knew that the choices he made today would determine their future forever, and the path ahead looked completely terrifying. But as the elevator doors slid open, he heard the sharp, unmistakable click of heels hurrying across the marble floor behind him, cutting through the silence of the top floor. Paulo turned around to see Viera Queen walking briskly toward him, holding his security badge in her hand. Behind her, the senior vice president stood frozen in the doorway of her office, flanked by two confused security guards. Viera reached the elevator and extended her hand, pressing the button to hold the doors open. Her voice was no longer cold. It was breathless and filled with a rare, urgent intensity. She looked at Paulo and told him that he was not going to the hospital alone. On the drive to the municipal hospital in Viera's private car, the heavy silence between them finally broke. Paulo expected a lecture or further demands, but instead, Viera looked out the rainy window and revealed the truth she had hidden from the world. For months, everyone in the company assumed Viera was a cold, untouchable machine, and when Paulo had seen the deep purple bruises across her back, he had assumed she was a victim of physical abuse from a powerful partner. But the reality was entirely different. Viera was not a victim of violence. She revealed to Paulo that she had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive bone marrow illness that caused severe internal bruising, and she was secretly dying. She explained that from the very beginning she had not promoted him to buy his silence about her bruises. She had promoted him because of his daughter. Months ago, before anyone even knew his name, Viera had overheard Paulo on his cleaning break, softly comforting a crying Kenzie over the phone and carefully managing her medical details with absolute devotion. In a corporate world full of greedy managers who only cared about her wealth and power, Viera saw in Paulo a man of rare honesty and fierce loyalty. She knew her own time was limited, and she needed someone she could trust completely to handle her private affairs and eventually manage her charitable legacy. While they were driving, Viera's personal assistant called her to confirm that the senior vice president had been caught on the buildings. Internal server logs trying to frame Paulo, Viera ordered his immediate termination and legal prosecution. When they arrived at the hospital, Viera did not wait for Paulo to ask for help. She immediately contacted the hospital's chief of surgery, transferring the full payment for Kenzie's emergency heart operation within minutes and moving the young girl to the finest private medical suite available. Paulo sat by Kenzie's bedside, holding his daughter's small hand as she was prepared for the successful procedure. He looked up at Viera, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude that he could no longer contain. The woman he thought was a merciless tyrant had just saved his entire world. The twist of fate had shattered all of his assumptions. What he thought was a dangerous trap had turned out to be a lifeline, because an observant, dying CEO had recognized the true value of a devoted father's love. 2 years had passed since that rainy afternoon, and the world had changed completely for everyone involved. The bright afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the green lawns of the Queen Foundation's children's facility, Outside the main building, a healthy, energetic 9-year-old girl was running through the grass, her laughter echoing clearly through the air. It was Kenzie Fernandez. Her cheeks were full of color, her breathing was perfectly steady, and the fragile weakness that had once defined her childhood was completely gone. Paulo Fernandes stood near the edge of the patio, holding a clipboard in his hands, watching his daughter with a peaceful smile. He no longer wore a faded blue janitorial uniform or a cheap, borrowed suit. As the newly appointed director of the Queen Charitable Foundation, Paulo spent his days managing funding for families who could not afford expensive pediatric medical treatments. Viera Queen had completely stepped down from her intense corporate role at Queen Enterprises to focus entirely on her specialized medical care. Her illness was still a daily battle, but with advanced treatments and a significantly reduced stress level, she had managed to find a stable, comfortable path forward. Viera sat in a comfortable chair under the shade of a large oak tree, a soft blanket resting over her lap. Her face was no longer a frozen, unreadable mask of corporate stone. The sharp lines around her mouth had softened into a genuine, relaxed expression. She watched Kenzie kick a bright soccer ball across the grass, a faint smile appearing on her lips. Paulo walked over and stood beside her, offering her a cup of the warm herbal tea she still enjoyed. She took it with a nod of appreciation, her fingers showing much less of the heavy tremor that had once plagued her during her loneliest corporate days. They did not speak for a long moment, watching Kenzie play. They did not need to fill the silence with endless words. The bond between the former janitor and the former CEO had grown into a deep, unbreakable respect built on shared survival. Paulo looked down at the documents on his clipboard. Reviewing the list of 3 families whose children would receive full medical funding this month, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His long nights of scrubbing floors and skipping meals had led him through an agonizing storm, but it had brought him to a place where he could prevent other parents from feeling that same terrifying helplessness. The journey had taught both of them an invaluable lesson about human nature and the hidden battles people fight every single day. True strength is not found in a flawless facade, but in the willingness to acknowledge our shared struggles and support one another through life's hidden pain. Looking out at the peaceful scene, Paulo realized that the unscripted moments of life, the wrong turns, the unlocked doors, and the terrifying crises are often the very things that break open our isolated worlds, allowing light, hope, and healing to finally enter.